places, and it looked as good as anything. Some of you east of here are saying, well, not yet. But eventually, we're going to have to start thinking about heifers and stuff. So that's why I wanted to talk a little bit this morning. Just the last time when I changed the title of this talk was in 2015. I used to just call it replacement heifer management or something boring like that. But when some of these guys were paying $3,000 for a heifer, their expectations were pretty high, weren't they? So I kind of changed that. But just looking back, I mean, remember what it was like in 15. That's some data from Texas. I mean, 35 trillion gallons of water fell on the state of Texas in the month of May, 8 inches, enough to cover the state 8 inches deep. So one of these days it's going to happen, okay? And I think we saw some hope yesterday. But so look at replacement costs. We did some pretty detailed analysis back then, and I took that slide out because I knew you guys couldn't see it. But heifers cost in 2023, heifers cost 30% less than they did in 2015 versus, when I go back and look at those numbers. Right now they're about even because feed's 33% more. So we're pretty much where we were back there when some of those heifers were $1,500 to $3,000 a piece. So that's the cost. 2015, it was costing you about $2,021 to either keep a heifer in a developer or go out and buy one in developer, and we're about at the same place. In that should be 2022. I'm getting old. I can't remember the years. So just background, we probably all know this. Heifers should have their first calf probably by the time they're 2 years of age. I know a lot of these big outfits still kind of, maybe some of them hold them till they're 3 just to get away from calving problems and stuff. But all the data would indicate that if you wait till 3, you'll probably never catch up on losing that first calf. And with all the things we have now with EPDs and Cavanese bulls and things like that, I think it's more feasible probably for most people than ever. Puberty in yearlings, just to review, is two things control puberty in heifers. Age, according to breed type, so our English breed types, Angus, Herefords, you're looking probably at 12 months. Get into our continental breeds or our American breeds like Brangus, probably looking at 15 months. Either way, you can get there by 2, as long as they have an appropriate body weight. And our rule of thumb on that has always been 60 to 65% of their expected mature weight. Talk a little bit about that in a minute, but that's kind of the rule of thumb. We're pretty far out of the straight Brahman country, but if you ever do mess with, anything 3/4 to straight Bos Indicus breeding, you're probably looking at closer to 18 months of age for puberty, which mathematically doesn't work out for some people. So a lot of times they'll wait to 2 years old to breed those straight Bos Indicus cattle. But most of the rest of them, somewhere between 12 to 15 months of age, they should be puberable. And if they weigh enough, things should happen. We know that, of course, age is another big one, right? Older they are, more mature they're going to be. So if you have the opportunity, pick from the ones born in the first half of the calving season. That's not possible for some people because you're out there and you don't see them and you don't know when they calve in these big pastures. So we know that 2-year-old first calf heifer after she's had her calf is probably as hard to get bred back, especially if things are tough, as anything you'll do the rest of her life. So my whole kind of message this morning is to be able to manage those heifers as yearlings and as 2-year-olds to get them bred that second calf and set them up for the rest of their life, because that's kind of what we're after, okay? So it's great if you know when they calve. That's great. If you're out there, you probably don't. If you're down there in the Chinati Mountains, you probably don't. So what do we do? If calving dates are not an option for heifers, we pick the biggest ones. A lot of people will do that. We expect them to be the most mature. They'll weigh more, so theoretically they'll take less feed to reach target weight. However, over time, it may lead to bigger cows. There's about a 70% correlation between weaning weight and mature weight. So that's something to kind of watch. I guess around this part of the world, drought takes care of that, right? We got about 5 years along, and it's time to sell everything, and we get to start over anyway. But if you're keeping those animals for replacements over time, you will have a chance of just getting to bigger cows if you just keep picking the biggest heifers. So another deal, a lot of people do this, just keep a whole bunch and select replacements after the first breeding season. Pick the ones you like that are pregnant, sell the other ones that are pregnant. That's a good way to do it. It takes more resources because you keep them longer and you have to feed them. And we'll see here in a minute, you probably have a pretty good chance of making that up on the back end. And I'll talk about maybe some other things to do here later on. So target weight, that's a fun thing. We got into a bit of a discussion probably, 10 years ago, Ron, on was all the research done in the 60s and 80s really, really correct? So puberty occurs at a predetermined weight. That was, just the rule of thumb for forever. Some research came out maybe, I don't know now, maybe 20 years ago, 15 years ago. A lot of it was done in Nebraska, and they took these heifers and they developed them to lighter weights at 50 to 57% of mature body weight. And those heifers were able to reach puberty and breed at acceptable rates. But if you look at that data, it was a research station at USDA in Nebraska, they had all the data on those cows' mothers. So they knew what expected mature weight was. How many of y'all know that? I mean, look at the variation in the cow herd, right? So you don't know exactly what expected mature weight on the cows is. So my sort of rule of thumb is probably need a little insurance policy. 60% is my thought on that, because you really don't know unless you've got detailed records on their mothers and granddams and all that. You probably don't know exactly what mature weight is in the cow herd. So little insurance, in my opinion. We all know that developing heifers is a big one. We get dry and things don't go the way we want them to. Seasonal forage changes, Wesley mentioned that yesterday, and I'll show you a little example of that. So, he mentioned timing the breeding season to correlate or coincide with the green up. Easy enough said, right? There's years, we all know this, right? Some years it rains in the spring, some years it rains in the summer, some years it doesn't rain at all. This is some data we did back in the late 90s down at Marfa, and that's only, really 2 years of data. And I can tell you, if you look back, because they've got rainfall records on that ranch every month, every week for back into the 30s. But I know there's years down there where it rained in the springtime and it didn't rain in the summer. But you got to go with where the chances are, right? And so you get further over in the Chihuahuan Desert, like we saw this year, and if we get monsoon rains in the summer, that's when the green up is. So what we did on this set of cattle, we took fecal samples on them, sent them to the lab for the nut ball analysis. That's not a perfect yield either, but that was our options. So obviously the blue bars are rainfall. You can see that the first year it started raining in August, September, and we really had a little rain starting about July, but July, August, September, that's kind of when we think we might get rain out there in most normal years. Dries off in the fall. 97, it rained all, started in the spring, and it was a good year. It's not the good years, right? It's those tough years, so you might only get rain a few months. Going into 98, it really didn't even rain till August. They got really the most rain in August, and that was it. So the red bars are the dietary crude protein, following by month from those fecal samples. The yellow line is protein requirements, and you can see that in those 3 years, during the breeding season, protein requirement was underneath dietary protein. So they were meeting their protein requirements just off green grass. But if we had shifted during those 3 years, we'd have been off when it was green. So that's the way they did those cows. They were not supplemented. They were mature cows, and they were expected to get by on grass. And you'll notice during the fall, the requirements probably exceed intake a little bit, but they were living off the fat on their backs and coasting on into the next year. You get a good year in the middle, and that kind of heals things up, and off we go. But that wouldn't work everywhere, but that works for that environment most of the time, I would say. Here's some data that Doug Tollison collected when he was in Arizona, just showing the effect of forage quality on intake in young heifers, because again, their rumens aren't quite big enough. Dietary digestible energy had to be around 52% in order for a heifer to be able to eat enough rumen capacity to meet her energy needs. So how often does that happen? There's times that they get low on energy, and we have to make that up again with supplement or something else. So this is probably no surprise, but if they're having heat cycles prior to the start of the breeding season, you got a lot better chance of getting them bred. Some data from Montana and Nebraska. I don't know if you can see it, but number of ester cycles prior to the start of the breeding season. If they had 0 heat cycles prior to the start of the breeding season, preg rates as yearlings was 84%. If they had experienced 1 or more heat cycles the first year prior to the breeding season, preg rates were statistically higher, 90 to 94%, but the real difference was in the second pregnancy. If they'd had 0 or more heat cycles before their first pregnancy, the second pregnancy was 62%. Even though they were 84% the first time, they were probably late to get pregnant. They were late calvers, and it caught up with them as a second calf. Again, if you'd had 3 or more heat cycles prior to the start of the first breeding season, as a 2-year-old, that jumped from 62% at 0 to 83%. So back to that 2-year-old heifer. That's when things start to show up, okay? Pregnancy and timing of first pregnancy affects, as we saw, pregnancy in later years. And that slide is as a 2-year-old, but that carries all through life. So it'll affect calving patterns, and obviously weaning weights follow calving patterns, so that follows her through the rest of her life. It affects cow longevity, how long they stay in the herd, and then even, financial end of things, lifetime return on an investment for that animal. Okay? So here's some data that was taken a long time ago from L.R. Sprott down at A&M, but he worked with 5 different herds, put them into 21, broke them into 4 periods for calving. There's their weaning weights. There's no surprise there. The earlier calvers wean the heavier calves. That's no surprise. Here's some data from USDA Meat Animal Research Center. They broke those calving periods into first period. They had over 11,000 animals there. Second calving period, 4,000. Last calving period, a little over 1,000. Pregnancy, second time, you can follow it across. It's consistent. Second calf, 93% versus 84. Follow them out to their 6th pregnancy, 94%. They finally caught up there a little bit, but it was consistent, out to maybe the 4th or 5th pregnancy. So just more examples. Data from Mark, 16,000 Angus, and then George Perry repeated that somewhat in South Dakota, but that's age at when they were first open. So if they were in the first calving period, they were first open at about 8 years of age on average, which, you think about how all the things that we call cows for, it's not just being open, right? So all that other stuff, temperament, lameness, all that stuff enters in there. But so that's, 8 years. Is about a little over 7 years if they calved in the middle period, and if they calved in that latter period, they were about almost a year less in longevity for lifetime, lifetime. George Perry showed the same thing. He only broke it into the first and second. But again, in South Dakota, those cows fell out a little earlier, on average at about 5 years, but it was a little closer to 4 on the late calvers. So anyway, interestingly enough, and I don't know why, maybe somebody could explain that, but this even affects steer calves. So they followed in some of this data. They followed performance in steers from mothers that calved early. So it affected everything, obviously, from weaning weight, but it even affected carcass characteristics. So the marbling scores were significantly higher. Maybe they were just older and a little more mature and able to maybe marble a little quicker in the feed yard. Quality grade, again, was affected. So kind of interesting what all is involved there. Average lifetime and return on investment, again, back to those same 5 herds that L.R. Sprott worked with, but you can kind of follow that data. Herd 1, pretty well managed. They made money on all of their cattle, but if average lifetime return on investment on 1,500 cows and calves, from 1,500 cows, made about 15% return on investment for that per cow in that first herd. It was about half that if they calved at the very end. This guy in the middle was losing money. Must have had a day job or 2 or 3, but he lost a lot less on those early calvers than he did on the late calvers, and the other places were kind of in the middle. So how do we manage this? What can we do out here? So some data from New Mexico showed that, and this is no surprise, I'm sure, but they looked at range developed versus feedlot or confinement developed heifers, and obviously on those cattle, when they put them in on high quality forage, they responded very quickly. But when they put them on severe diet restriction, they were having heat cycles, and after 14 days, they were monitoring ovulatory activity. 70% became anovulatory, and 100% cycling heifers. This actually was done in Oklahoma, the second part, but they were severely restricted. I mean, you wouldn't probably experience that out in the pasture, but it just shows what can happen when diet changes, either for the good or the bad, in a short period of time. Old data from New Mexico. Some of you may even remember some of this, but it was done back in the late 80s, looking at ways to save money on supplementation. So they looked at feeding high-quality protein supplements in 2 different years. The first trial lasted 130-day development period. Second trial was a little longer. They fed a cottonseed cake either once a week or twice a week, and the average daily gain was about the same whether they fed them once a week or twice a week. You know, a big pile or a little pile spread out, 3 times a week. Preg rates were almost identical. Cost per head, if you adjust that to modern cost, is there in the blue. They saved about 60% in labor and transportation costs by feeding once a week instead of 3 times a week. So that could be significant in big old pastures. Some people have to check water. Some people like to see their cows more frequently, but in that situation, that's what it showed. What's the key? Situation, maybe we're like over here, east of here, where we're out of grass and we need energy to go with it, and we have to look at energy supplements. Probably can't even get grain cubes anymore, but if you are feeding a high starch supplement where you have to feed protein and energy to make up for short grass, They fed those high energy supplements the same way they fed them as high protein, those 41% cottonseed cake, 74% TDN, which was pretty high in energy as well. They could feed that twice a week, and they got 100% preg rate on that ration, feeding it twice a week. If they tried to do the same thing feeding a high grain supplement, preg rates fell. The energy value per feeding was the same, but because they were hitting them with such a load of starch, preg rates fell to 68% with that high grain supplement, feeding it the same way they did the protein. If they changed that to feeding it daily, they got less starch in the diet, they spread it out, and preg rates were almost as good as feeding that high protein supplement twice a week. So what's the message there? If you have short grass and you have a situation where you need to get both energy and protein into them, you're going to have to feed those high grain supplements a lot more frequently. What's the downside there? Feed them every day, they're going to greet you. They're going to open the gate for you. You know, glad you're here, time to feed. But I don't know any other way around that. So another thing that might be in your toolbox, this has been looked at. We talk about protein being either degradable or undegradable. What you want, it sounds bad, but you want degradable protein in the diet. That's the first priority, because that's what feeds the rumen microbes, is degradable protein. So that's most supplements are that way. There are some supplements that contain protein that escapes the rumen. Some people call it degradable, some people call it bypass or escape protein. There's different words for it, but it basically goes by the rumen and goes into the hindgut and is digested there as protein. That's called ruminally undegradable protein, and they looked at that in some trials here at New Mexico State. They increased the energy in the animal with bypass protein. They didn't get reproduction on that particular trial, but they did follow that up where they fed a feedlot, normal feedlot ration to some confinement developed heifers. The retention rate on those as 3 and 4 year olds was about 43%. So that was a normal development. But if they had range developed heifers and they fed them a 50% undegradable protein diet, the retention rate at 3 and 4 years went up to 68%. If you backed off of that back to 30%, it affected retention rate. So they had to have a high level of undegradable protein. Bad news, that looks really great. Eric Solgertis, I was visiting with him. He's the one that did this. Most of these big feed companies, he tells me these days, you can't get them to mix any kind of animal protein like feather meal. They just won't do it. So they tried to recreate that with some corn gluten, which is obviously a non-animal type protein, and it just didn't work as well. So he's frustrated right now. He's looking for some small mills or something that will access some of this feather meal or something, but to just go down and, so I mean, that's a thing, maybe, but getting it done may not be all that practical right now. So how do you know? This is back to some more practical things, I guess. Obviously, body weights in first calf heifers, we talked about that. Obviously, body condition scores on 2-year-olds and on up through the cow years. Obviously, if you're feeding hay, run off a forage sample, sometimes you can go out in the pasture and pick hay, hand pluck samples. That's not always easy to do in a 10-section pasture. I understand that. And I mentioned the NIRS fecal sampling. I think it's a good tool. I wouldn't lean on it completely because those equations aren't perfect. It's an estimate of dietary protein and energy based off some fresh fecal samples. You can take them and send them in and use that along with your other tools. Obviously, we probably know that one too, right? If we're out there and we see a nice cow pie on the grass, they're probably getting enough protein to at least keep that rumen functioning. If we see those cow pies stacking up around the water in the dead of winter, probably an indication that they are at least protein deficient in the diet. So we actually have an extension publication that goes through some of those pictures and correlates them back to what the actual grass quality was. But in my my toolbox, those are the things that probably are there. So how do we pick them to be early calvers? Obviously, we talked about that. Oldest, biggest. Reproductive tract scores. If you've never heard of that, it's a very accurate way to go in. You palpate the reproductive tract right before the breeding season. You evaluate the condition of the uterus, the activity on the ovaries. It's a pretty good way to predict puberty. It's about 32% heritable. It is highly correlated, guess what, with age and weight. So, surprise, surprise. The problem with that, in my opinion, is finding qualified people to do that. It's hard enough to find somebody to become AI or something for you. To find somebody that can go do that either with palpation or ultrasound, you know, they're out there, but you have to find them. So it is what it is. Genomic testing, they have some tests now for the Angus. The database isn't really, I think Red Angus is not far behind, Ron, or is that? I think Red Angus is getting close, but they've got a large enough database in the Angus herd that they can do genomic testing on calves and predict their future reproduction potential. They also have it where they can look at lifetime production, feed efficiency, as well as feedlot performance. So it's an option. Just talking about other tools besides picking the oldest or the biggest. So some more strategies maybe for early breeders. Early pregnancy testing. 25 years ago, if you wanted to get, or more, if you wanted to get heifers born early, you had to probably use a 40-day or less, a really tight breeding season, so you could make them breed early. We can do the same thing now and use a normal breeding season, 90 to 120 days. You either get in there with ultrasound, 28 to 30 days into the breeding season for those heifers, bring them in, you test them, either ultrasound or a blood test on first calf heifers. You know who's pregnant to the blood test, you turn them back out, bring them in at the end of the normal breeding season. You've got some more pregnant heifers. You can do whatever you want with them, sell them, do whatever, but you've identified those ones that conceived early in the breeding season. And so this is a thing I know more and more people are probably using, especially as we get more and more ultrasound out there in the country. If you're not familiar with the blood test, well, holler at me. It's another way to test them and find those early breeders. So ester synchronization with natural service. That's a picture of Ron Gill's calves off natural. That's natural service, wasn't it, Ron? That was AI? Okay. Anyway, same thing. Natural service has been, with ester synchronization, has been used for 50 or more years. You know, you bring them in, you give them a shot at the beginning of the breeding season, turn the bulls in. Those heifers that are cycling and in the right stage of their cycle to respond to the shot, most of them should conceive on that first breeding season. But that's kind of what we're after, all right? No secret there. Old data, but looking at normal herds versus AI, obviously the weaning rate was a little bit higher, weaning weight was a little bit higher, just because with an AI program you're going to force those heifers, or not all of them, but those that conceive early to AI are going to have the oldest calves. Okay, so thinking about this, a few years ago I thought, well, when you use that one-shot AI system at the beginning of the breeding season, you're going to miss a few heifers that are pubertal just because they're naturally cycling and they're not in a stage to respond to that shot. So we got 3 ranches, pretty big ranches, because we wanted to have a large pool of replacement heifers. So one of those ranches was in South Texas, beef master bulls on black and red Angus cows with an 80-day breeding season. The other ranch we did with Wesley up there at Canadian, we had black and red Angus, a little bit of Hereford with a 100-day breeding season, another 100 heifers. And then the third ranch was out near where I live, Angus and Hereford crosses with a 90-day breeding season. So we, instead of giving that shot, and again, this requires another gather, but if you're looking at finding every pubertal heifer, this is the only way I could think of to do it. Instead of synchronizing them and giving that one shot of prostaglandin on the day we turned the bulls in, we put the bulls in, we gathered everybody up, 4 days after we turned the bulls in, and we gave those heifers their first shot of prostaglandin. Prostaglandin, you've probably always heard, never give it to a pregnant animal because it will abort them, but it won't abort them before 6 days. So the theory here is, I don't know if you can see it, but that's the old chart from the AI manual on a one-shot prostaglandin. If you're AI and you check heat for 5 days or 6 days, you give the shot of prostaglandin in the middle of the heat check period, and in 12 days, theoretically, you've got all the heifers that would respond ready to AI. So that's basically what we did here. We just started the breeding season. We waited 4.5 days to give the shot. Theoretically, we wouldn't miss any heifers we wouldn't miss any heifers that were cycling before the breeding season because they were in a spot where they wouldn't respond to the prostaglandin. So by waiting 4.5 days, we hopefully caught all the heifers that were ready to go. Okay, so they were pubertal at the start of the breeding season, having heat cycles like I showed you, because they were able to respond to that. They won't respond to prostaglandin unless they're already having heat cycles. Okay, so they were either cycling naturally on the first 5 days of that breeding season, or they responded to the shot during the latter 12 days of the breeding period. If they were conceived in that 12-day period, we know they were fertile. So just because they're cycling doesn't mean they're always going to conceive. But if they did conceive, we knew they were both fertile and able to respond. That's the South Texas ranch as yearlings. It's dry, but it's not that bad. That's the South Texas ranch the second year. It was terrible, just terrible. And so our data on 2-year-olds wasn't what I hoped it would be. That's the results. We didn't get 2-year-old data on 2 of those ranches. Up here at Canadian, we just didn't get it collected. I won't go into it. Nobody's fault. We didn't get it collected. Far West Texas, we didn't get it collected either. But on the South Texas ranch, all 3 ranches, the overall preg rate on those heifers for first calves, 86% South Texas, 90 Panhandle, 91. So that's all good. If they were pregnant in the first 12 days of the breeding season off the prostaglandin shot, 41% pregnant first calf, 54 in the Panhandle, 54 in West Texas in the first 12 days of the breeding season. If you look at the average herd weight at breeding, pretty similar, 800 pounds, 675. But if you follow this down here to the percent pregnant in the first 12 days that were less than the average or median herd weight, 35% of those smaller heifers were fertile and responded. 60% up here at Canadian were smaller than the average and they responded, and about 50% were smaller than the average and responded in the first 12 days. It didn't, like I said, South Texas was so terrible the second year. We had a numerically little higher preg rate, but it wasn't significant because things were so bad down there. But we would predict based on what we know, that would follow through as 2-year-olds. So if you're looking to maybe pick fertile heifers that are going to conceive early, but you're worried about that body size thing that Wesley talked about, that might be a way to manage that. I don't know. It might work. So we looked at the cost of this, just looking at if we wanted to have an 80% preg rate and we wanted to pick 15 heifers at yearling as weanlings and develop them, or if we wanted to keep all 100 head for the whole development period. We looked at the economics of all of that. Obviously, if you're only going to keep 15, cost on that was about $15,800 to keep the 15. If you're going to keep 100, significantly higher, about a little over 100,000. But the revenue on the backside obviously was higher if you're selling those older and pregnant heifers. So net revenue per head was slightly higher, but your overall costs were higher. You have to allow for stocking rate adjustments and things like that. So we anticipated that the heifers that conceived within the first 12 days of the breeding season would have higher preg rates as 2-year-olds. Really, we didn't get that data collected, but all that data from South Dakota and everywhere else I showed you would indicate that they certainly would have, and that probably would have lasted throughout their lives. So using ester synchronization either off natural service or even off an AI program will allow you to identify and select directly for puberty and fertility. So if body weight and frame score at breeding was measured in conjunction with the early breeding protocol, you could go back and pick heifers that were pregnant and maybe smaller than what you might want, and that might be a way to maybe moderate cow size in your herd and also select for lifetime productivity. So again, if you keep a whole bunch of heifers and breed them, in the good years, you can kind of run those as kind of think of it as a stocker enterprise, maybe keep a few less, maybe twice what you need in a average to below average year, and run those, and then pick your pregnant ones from the early breeders. However you want to go about doing that, whether it's early pregnancy testing or using response to ester synchronization to help identify those ones that are cycling and ready to go at the first. So that's my thoughts on heifers, and I know it's tough, but I guess the idea, get them bred early, and hopefully that'll keep them going as cows. So anyway, any questions or anything on any? Yes, sir. We get that question a lot, and it's a good one, and John might want to chime in. If you obviously on all of this, fertility test those bulls, I don't care what, but assuming they've all passed the BSE, and with small numbers of bulls, 2 or 3 bulls, just odds are sometimes you're going to get bulls that don't work as hard as others, but on average, you might need, rather than 1 to 25 or something, maybe 1 to 15. Any thoughts on that? 1 to 10. And so, but yeah, and you can rotate them, so if you got enough, so they're not all, you concentrate your bull power as well. So yeah, that's a good question. I should have mentioned that. We get that usually. All right, thanks.